2 decades following the war that destroyed the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia, a protest banner on the streets of Zagreb renewed the call for battle. In 1991 against Yugoslavia, in 2014 against the Yugoslavs. That's what says on the banner. Installed by the Croatian Homeland War veterans as part of their 555-day-long tent revolution, the banner declared a mission incomplete, detecting the Yugoslavs as an unwanted remainder of the country that had been successfully wiped out of the historical stage. Who are these resurrected Yugoslavs? And are the veterans really sure that Yugoslavia did not return with them? Despite the fact that only 331 Yugoslavs appeared in Croatia's 2011 census, where they were officially categorized in the impossible to categorize category, together with 24 Martians and 20 Klingons, it would be wrong to think of the veterans as simply paranoid. While accusing the liberal political elite, and it's them who they wrongly designated as Yugoslavs, of betraying the defensive homeland war by portraying it as merely a civil war, the veterans performed their own revision of patriotic history. Instead of repeating the usual claim of Croatia's self-defense against what is officially called the Great Serbian Aggression, the veterans' slogan renamed their struggle as one against Yugoslavia, thereby accidentally but truthfully presenting the 90s war not as a clash of certain ethnic groups against others, but one in which they all partook, albeit in different ways, in the destruction of Yugoslavia as a common project of emancipation and equality. So 20 years later, the Yugoslavs have indeed returned, but not in the guise of unpatriotic politicians, but rather in the voices of those who came to question and oppose this destruction. And here I have in mind, first of all, the opposition that takes place in the arena of history, which has at the same time been, at least since the 80s, one of the key front lines of Yugoslavia's decomposition. In 1988, in the last attempt to write a comprehensive 20th century history of Yugoslavia, historian Branko Petranović complained of the sinister trends towards what he called the confederalization of Yugoslav history. This is just so you can imagine what kind of confederalization he has in mind, which appeared in books only as a carefully proportioned and bound set of separate national and regional histories, a mere arithmetic addition, he wrote, as if there were no such thing as the all-Yugoslav currents and the all-Yugoslav meaning of events. So today, after Yugoslav history was violently smashed to pieces, and its remains incorporated into predominantly nationalist historiographies of the post-Yugoslav nation states or transitional constructs such as Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, new generations are resuming Petranovic's unfulfilled mission of historical synthesis. This is the map of Eastern European art, and this is one of the first projects curated actually by Jelena Vesic, in which we also participated, that I think was really the first one that brought on a larger scale this term Yugoslav, that really wanted to talk about Yugoslav or post-Yugoslav art while questioning the very prefix post and bracketing it. So in the past decade, a growing number of art historians, artist curators, historians, and sociologists of culture have identified Yugoslav art and Yugoslav history, and not, Croatian, Serbian, Balkan, or Central European, not only as objects of their study, but also as a subject of a certain politics, which usually also involves an affirmative attitude towards a number of idiosyncratic Yugoslav legacies, such as the partisan struggle in the Second World War, socialist self-management, non-alignment, non-aligned modernism. And some of these things have become relatively fashionable recently, especially when it comes to the modernist monuments. The majority of these or counter-historicizations, however, have taken for granted the very condition that makes them possible, and this is their gathering under the signifier Yugoslav. What is the meaning of this signifier if it is not to be taken, as is usually the case, as a simple geographical and historical container for the socio-political tenets that marked the presumably exceptional status of Yugoslavia following its expulsion from the Cominform in 1948? In order to probe this question, we must return to where we began, to Yugoslavs, or rather to Yugoslavism as a particular form of failed and ever-failing nationalism, which, precisely in this failure, opens up the space for alternative, non-proprietary forms of belonging. As a people without a nation, the enemies of the nation-state veterans, Yugoslavs are the ideal proprietors of the property without the owner, or social property, which Branimir Stojanovic talked about in the previous session. The reason why we must speak of these liberatory formations in oxymoronic terms is because they disturb the hegemonic logic that defines the boundaries of identity and economy, and claiming place for what is out of place, for what can only be addressed as an oxymoron, is what I see as the task of what I'm trying to think of as a Yugoslav aesthetics. And here, rather than Yugoslav art, meaning art made in Yugoslavia, Yugoslav aesthetics is something that is strongly informed by the Yugoslavism of the Yugoslav, which I'm not sure I will be able to get into fully today. But as I promised in my abstract, I will talk about the monument group as an example of this work of Yugoslav aesthetics, the way I see it. Okay, so the origin of monument group, a public collaborative platform, goes back to a series of meetings organized in the early 2000s in Belgrade by artist Milica Tomic under the heading Conversations about a Work of Art. When it was proposed during one session that the work of art to be discussed was the city of Belgrade's open competition for what was initially called the Monument to the Fallen Fighters and Victims of the 1990 to 1999 wars, including the NATO bombing on the territory of former Yugoslavia, the conversations decidedly shifted from analyzing finished artworks to testing the kind of work that art could do in the political arena. The group's contestation of the competition unveiled, first of all, that what the competition called the 1990 to 1999 wars was in fact a war without a name, the namelessness revealing the conspicuous lack of narrative about who were the fighters and who the victims. And as we saw earlier, although the war in Croatia has an official name and an official narrative, the slippage into ambiguity is still constitutive of the public discourse surrounding it, with the name of the war shifting from homeland war to civil war to the war against Yugoslavia. So this problem of the collective bestowal of meaning and the naming of the ultimately unnameable shared past became the primary task around which the group coalesced. By naming themselves monument groups, so performing this first act of naming, in 2006, the group interrupted their participation in what until then was the dialogue with the government regarding the commissioned monument, and declared that their own work, including the set of ongoing public discussions, in fact constituted a monument. This decision was based on the postulate in Branimir Stojanovic's words, that it was impossible to relay upon any imaginable object the responsibility which is ours. And ours here refers first of all to intellectuals, for as Stojanovic also stated, we, the cultural intellectual scene of ex-Yugoslavia, are all frozen in a pre-1990 situation. We have no language, no poetry, no theory, no literature to account for what happened in the 90s. So the task of intellectual practice here, which also implies art, was to engage in a group work in order to come up with new language that would provide the kind of understanding able to puncture the impasse of the present and open it up not only to a new vision of the past, but also the future. On the surface, this relationship between an unnameable or unspeakable past and the language to address it resembles the structure of traumatic memory and attempts to articulate it. But the work of monument groups should not be confused with that. In fact, by claiming in their work on the Srebrenica genocide since 2008 that genocide is speakable, they explicitly distance themselves from the discourses that arose in the wake of the Holocaust and which stress its unrepresentability. At the same time, they also reject what they call American pragmatism, a supposedly rational way of dealing with trauma implemented in the post-Yugoslav region in the form of so-called transitional justice under the guidance of various international political, judicial, scientific, and humanitarian organizations. So again, the goal is finding a completely new language. And one way in which they've done that is to propose the concept of the matheme of genocide. Oh, sorry. I don't know where that came. Grounded in Jacques Lacan's own attempt to change the language of psychoanalysis by mathematizing it and making it universally valid. In this way, the Monument Group argued, the truth of genocide could not only be expressed, but also made transhistorically communicable beyond the usual devices that rely on context, expression, and narration. This move towards mathematization, I would argue, must also be understood as a move beyond the practices of memorialization and towards the writing and making of history. While memory, including counter-memory, addresses the particular and is inherently attached to the idea of experience and a fidelity to the position of victim, history translates the particular suffering into some common principle in order to derive from it not only an account of what happened, but also a vision of what should happen in the future. This does not mean that memories of individual or collective suffering do not matter, but then in the kind of history making that I have in mind and that I think the Monument Group is engaged in, they become part of a greater effort of large-scale historical transformation. And actually here I also wanted to show, just briefly mention the project of Four Faces of Omarska, which Milica Tomic initiated, where sort of the same thing happened. The project took place in close collaboration and conversation with the survivors of the death camp in the Omarska mining complex, but it went far beyond that, So this particular case became, again, a sort of a formula of Yugoslav, but then also of global history, where, we could see how the socialist mine transformed first into a death camp during the war, and then it transformed into a part of a multinational corporation. So some patterns that go beyond the particular crime that happened there, while still not annulling it, but rather using it precisely as the ground on which to build this greater historical narrative. So this translation from the particular to the universal is also operative in Monument Group's central critical intervention, which concerns the religious and forensic practices surrounding the exhumation and identification of the bodies of the boys and men massacred in the Srebrenica genocide in 1995. And this is a process also known as the reassociation of identity. Despite what another group member, Jasmina Husanovic, called a depoliticized bioinformational governing of trauma, this rationalizing process has turned into what Sarah Wagner has described as a forensic nightmare. As one of the main obstacles, forensic experts cite high commingling due to one or more relocations of the victims' bodies from one mass grave to another in the attempt to cover up the crime. As well as the heavy machinery used in this process, the bodily remains are so intermixed that one case, that is a bag containing the remains collected by archaeologists on site, often contains several individuals, I quote from these forensic reports, and even the DNA analysis developed especially for this process can't identify all the bodies. Some of them are greatly deteriorated by environmental conditions, and others are contaminated, again, a term used by forensic anthropologists, by contact with other DNA, whether from bacteria or other mortal remains. Intrinsic contamination, as DNA analyst Sheila Idrisbegovic reported during the Monument Group public discussion in Belgrade, results from, quote, the fact that the body lay in a mass grave where bodies are simply falling apart together. End quote. The lab workers, as another forensic anthropologist reports, quote, take all necessary precautions to prevent burying more persons in one grave, as this is simply unacceptable. At the same time, this insistence on the wholeness and non-contamination of the individual is accompanied by an anonymizing collectivization. All victims of the Srebrenica genocide are buried at the same location, and according to Islamic rite, they're all declared to be shaheeds or Islamic martyrs, regardless of the fact whether they had in fact practiced religion during their life. So in her book, Sarah Wagner actually reports one woman who was standing next to her and told her that she feels very nervous about having her brother buried in this rite because he was an atheist, but that ultimately she decided to bury him with the others. And I think this is a really great image of this coercion of collectivization, ethnic and religious collectivization. So hundreds of identical green coffins gather each year to bury the newly identified victims at the Potocari commemoration site, the wholeness of the individual body transposed into the wholeness of the ethno-religious community. And bones that remain unidentified are stored in the ossuary together with remains that are identified but that await the rest of the body, because since it was impossible in most cases to reassemble the entire body, religious authorities decided that 70% of the body is the minimum for the person to receive a funeral rite. Although in practice, actually, the families can decide otherwise. Unidentified remains will ultimately most likely be buried in a common mausoleum, although, as forensic anthropologist Draga Vučetić points out, forensic teams plan to, quote, work with family organizations and local authorities to determine the most appropriate treatment for these elements that we have failed to connect to an individual. So, elements that we have failed to connect. With minimal editorial intervention, let these become elements that have failed to connect. And Vučetić can be said to have unwittingly produced a title for what could be called Monument Group's Manifesto of Disassociation, which conceives of the unidentified bones not as failures, not as something that is simply unacceptable, but as the very elements of hope. It is precisely by failing to connect to an individual, and necessarily also to a unanimous collective identity, that these bones have also failed to connect to their recuperation by what the group sees as the kind of identity production which repeats and perpetuates, by other means, the politics of terror that originated genocide. It is, and now I quote from one of Monument Group's textual and performative interventions, it is this unpleasant, radically inassimilable material remainder, that is the surplus of debased matter, of scattered excess bones, which opens up the real space of politics. It offers itself as literally the ground for a process of subjectivization that would not be identity bound and that would demand a different sort of memory politics, still quoting. We do not know the proper name of this political subjectivization tied to the non-identifiable corporeal remainder, but we do know that its mandate is to interrupt the parallel convergence of the contemporary constructions of identity and the politics of terror, end quote. So this invitation by Monument Group to embrace precisely what the politics of terror deems to be simply unacceptable, the debased matter, bones that have failed to connect, could perhaps be even further radicalized by suggesting two things. First, that the new politics arising from that should also disassociate itself from the notion of subjectivization. Rather than a new subject, what the ossuary and the Monument Group's work enable is a new form of grouping, oxymoronically based precisely on a willing decision to fall apart together, just like the bodies in forensic bags were judged to do. This failure of the bodies to become some bodies, the impossibility to decide whether the contaminated bacteria-bound bones are objects or subjects, matter dead or alive, demands of us to think beyond the necessarily heroic aspirations of subjecthood and to embrace the profane sociality of contaminated, simply unacceptable commingling. Secondly, besides providing an outline for the future, these elements that have failed to connect at the same time present a formula of Yugoslav history. Yeah, sure, I will. So, okay, so I will really now wrap up. Sorry, I didn't get your signals. You were very subtle. Okay. Yeah. So in a text on South Slavic identity, okay, I will really wrap up now. Philosopher Hugo Vlasavljević wrote of the attempts of the Yugoslav communists to create this overarching Yugoslav identity, but he says that they have failed because this injunction did not have an ethnic substance. Actually, continues Vlasavljević, since no proto-culture remained historically operative, the South Slavic proto-self that was supposed to serve as the basis of identity was found to have but bare bones. So in Vlasavljević's version, this is a proof of failure, right? But it is, I really see this as a beautiful way of connecting what Monument Group do to this very idea of Yugoslavism and Yugoslav history. You know, what is the substance of Yugoslav history? It's precisely these bare bones, right? So unlike the winning nationalisms, Yugoslavism did not have the historiographical meat that could be incorporated into a solid national body. But if historiography can only legitimately incorporate meat, then the bones, and not even simply bones, but bare bones, as if the bones were already not bare enough, should become the basis of another historiographical practice and another history, which shares with the famous Benjaminian notion of the history of the oppressed. So in short, this is what I see as the task of Yugoslav aesthetics, and we can talk more about how this relates to this very history of the idea of Yugoslavism as what I really see as a happily failed nationalism. Yugoslavism is related to the realm of failed ideas and artificial constructions, the two things that are often said about it. So it demands precisely a certain suspension of disbelief, just like the idea of a property without the owner and people without a nation, right? So a certain suspension of disbelief, but only in order to suspend the belief in the necessity of the really existing reality. And I think this is precisely what happens in the Monuments group trying to create the ossuary as the basis of the politics of the future. Thank you.